Hello and welcome to lecture on cotton and Southern slave society in the years before the Civil War, and this is a transition from period 4 into period 5, which is all about the rise and extension of slavery and the Civil War that ensues. So we're looking at the last key concept from period 4, that the acquisition of lands in the West gave rise to contests over the extension of slavery into new territories. So when we look at slaves, we need to dispel some of the myths and get down to what the reality was. And there's two opposing myths of slavery. One, that slaves were happy and well suited for this life, and that they enjoyed this life where they had no responsibilities and no cares and just had to get up and do the work, and of course that's just nonsense. But then there's one that, the violence, that it was excessively cruel and constantly whipping them all the time and raping them all the time, and that's a little closer to the truth, but it's also not necessarily the reality for all slaves. The reality is that one, it's a labor system, but it's also a complex series of human relationships as each adapts to the other. Now, it's a power relationship where we have the master who has absolute power, including even the power to kill over their slaves or sexually abuse them. But that depended on the master, it depended on the slaves and the ways that they might be able to resist and accommodate each other. So it's complex. It's not so simple as you might think. Now, it's about cotton and the growth of cotton in years after the War of 1812. And of course, just a little reminder that this is going back to the cotton gin that was allowing this, and also the high demand for cotton in England and then in New England as well. And we can see here these two graphs showing the cotton production going up exponentially in bales of cotton, thousands of bales. This is a bale. And the slave population also increasing at the same time. No new slaves coming in unless they're being smuggled in. The slave trade is over. And this map is also sort of showing the expansion. So each dot represents 200 slaves. We still have a few up in New York that will be gradually emancipated. This is Chesapeake and the tobaccos. Here's Carolinas and the rice. We've got some sugar over here, and this is 1820. Now, if you skip ahead to the cusp, the eve of the Civil War, boom. Now, we still have our tobacco and our rice, but now we've expanded into these cotton plantations down here. And cotton plantation, what it might look like. Now, keep in mind, cotton is the dominant industry. It's the base of the economy, but it's not the only industry. Like, there's forestry, there's some light industry, there's tobacco and other products as well. So a slave might not necessarily be in the field. He might be in a workshop, he might be in the household. He could be doing a number of things. Now, it's a self-perpetuating system where if you get started, you can purchase some lands, you can purchase some slaves, you can reap the rewards and earn some money and use that to purchase more land and more slaves, and it's self-perpetuating and created an elite, super rich, small group. Now, it's the leading export of the nation, north and south, and the capital it brought in often would be, it's going into banks, but then being loaned out and often to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And the North is benefiting from this as well. Bankers, as this growing economy, and the New England textile industry has a source of cheap cotton built and grown with slaves. And shipping of cotton is often done in northern ships. And Britain is benefiting from this as well, tied to with the cheap cotton. Another map sort of showing the expansion of cotton production, 1820 to 1860. You can see the expansion, and this new deep south of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and then the old south, is Virginia and Carolina. So it's a new economy, and showing the slaves. Now, slave ownership, vast majority, 3/4 owned 0 slaves, and then owning 1, 2 to 4, and increasing. And then here, the groups that own the most slaves, there's this red sliver, 50 to 100 slaves, and you can't even see it. It's such a small percentage that they owned 100 plus slaves, but they have power. We're going to call this group that owns most of the slaves the slaveocracy. Strong political influence. Very strong. People like Andrew Jackson, presidents, senators, governors of states, state legislatures, members in the House of Congress, right? They've got power and influence, and they're got the most to lose, so they've got a very strong interest in making sure that any attacks against the institution of slavery, whether on moral or economic grounds, are put down. So any debate over it, they will try to shut down the debate or argue strongly against any of the arguments opposing slavery. So what might the slaveocracy look like? They very much developed an aristocratic society where they're the lords, they're the masters, and they've got their peasants, their slaves, and they live in the big house. And the very small percent of the population, but very high in government, and own lots of land, lots of slave. They've got a little bit more time for leisure, for study, reflection, statecraft, getting involved in government. Felt a duty to be involved in government. Well educated, often in northern universities or English universities. Children would receive private tutored education, and they idolized their society, this sort of feudal society that they've recreated. Now, their point of view is slavery is necessary and beneficial, and that the North, if they're criticizing their wage labor system, or if the North is criticizing their slave labor system, they would then criticize the North's wage labor system and say, you don't treat your factory workers any better than we, we treat our slaves better than you treat yours. And they feel that the system should be allowed to expand. But their fear is that the North, with its growing population of immigrants and natural increase, that they're going to turn that growing population into a growing political power at the national level and use it to end the system of slavery. And that's their biggest fear. Or that northern extremists like abolitionists are going to foment and encourage slave uprising, and they very much fear, the slave entering their home at night and cutting their throats and leading a rebellion. And they're very much a bit stuck with this system. The environment, because cotton production leads to the soil's depletion, so they're often looking to opening up new lands to perpetuate and continue this system. It's concentrating wealth in the hands of a few, and it's leading to a very unstable economy that's not diverse. There's all of the capital is locked up within their slaves or in their land or in their cotton, so there's not a lot of fluid capital that could be used to invest in other things. If the price of cotton goes down, then the entire economy goes down as well. And they're not attracting immigrants. Why would an immigrant move into this society? Immigrants are attracted to the jobs that are available in the northern cities or in the lands of the West, where they can be free and independent. Now, what about this white majority? Okay, most of them are sort of backcountry mountain people. They're subsistent farmers. They're that, Thomas Jefferson idealized yeoman farmer who's on his own and doesn't need anybody else, and they're quite proud of that. They're stereotyped, and they suffered often from malnutrition and parasites, and they were ignorant but not stupid. They were just uneducated, many of them illiterate, couldn't read or write, and very much isolated and alone sort of people. And, the stereotype, but, there's some truth to this. The gun is necessary to defend yourself, and the stereotype. Now, why would this group, poor, why would they passionately support slavery? And they do. And they're the ones who are going to be defending in the Civil War and volunteering and fighting to the last man to continue this system. Well, one, they see with this, there is the ability to move up in society, that I can have a slave too at some point. And then there's the elevated status, and this comes down to racism. The belief that the worst white man is better than the best black man. And if slavery were to end, then they would be at the bottom of society. So they are the strongest advocates of the racial superiority of whites, and this will become embedded within the deep cultural thoughts of white Southern society. Now, plantations Importation of slavery had been banned in 1808, so there is smuggling, but the internal slave trade will skyrocket, where there's a lot of money to be made in the breeding of slaves. And there's going to be high demand for slaves on the cotton plantations. Largest investment of capital in the U.S. after land, and they are spared the most dangerous work. They wouldn't use them for dangerous work that might be involving explosions or other things, and they would hire Irish out for this to do dangerous work. They didn't care if they died. Different from South America and the Caribbean, there's higher turnover and higher deaths in the tropics, and so slaves are still being imported within South America and the Caribbean. But in the United States, they would have been born into the society. They would have no connection to Africa except through their own ancestors, their parents and grandparents. And differing concepts of race, where in the United States it was much more racism and much more sort of black and white. No sort of in-between gray areas or mulatto concepts. So in the United States, if your mother is black but your father is white, then you are black. Now, for female slaves, sexual abuse was common, and they could use this to obtain certain privileges, but it often would lead to jealous wives abusing them. And if you could breed, then you were prized for this, and you might often be rewarded for, producing, 10 children. Might earn you your freedom. And your biggest fear is that your children will be taken away from you, and this can be used as a threat that your children will be sold at a slave auction, which is what's being shown here. And so that's one of the threats and one of the means of control. But the most common one was the whip. And you would have breakers who would be used to break or tame any slaves that, especially dominant male slaves, that are showing any signs of resistance. And it might not just be a whip. It could be through sexual violence against males. Was not unheard of, though we're not quite sure just how common that was. And the drivers are the ones in the fields who are making sure that you're keeping up a good pace, and it's often a slave who's doing this, and he can use this as an opportunity to gain more privilege, more power for himself. And then resilience of the slaves, their main goal is to try to maintain the family, stay together, though that wasn't necessarily always possible. And then they found a lot of hope and the possibility of a better life within the Bible, that freedom will come with death in heaven. And then the story of Exodus, which is a story of a successful slave uprising in Egypt being led by Moses, the parting of the Red Sea story. So they took a lot of comfort in that. Another means of control, it's a collar with bells so that it's hard for you to run away. The woman on the right there is wearing one. And paradoxically or ironically, though, slaves were often put in important positions such as caring for children, and a lot of the young aristocratic children grew up with this, like a slave mummy. Now, resistance, always resisting, breaking equipment, slowing down, stealing, running away, which was quite effective, and revolt, but revolts were quite rare. There was sort of three that we should keep in mind. Vesey, 1822, but they were ratted out by others, who, remember, it's a complex series of relationships. Some would hear rumors of an uprising and might warn their master for privilege, which is one reason why they were quite rare. Nat Turner, which is maybe the best one to know and to use as an example, got off to a bit of a start. They killed 60 whites, mostly women and children, and then tried to make their way to the south, I believe, but they were captured and it was put down, and it led to very strict controls over them, and abolitionists were blamed for stirring up and encouraging these sort of revolts. And there was a very strong reaction against radical abolitionists. And Amistad was sort of a successful one. It was on a slave ship, and it was drifted into Long Island, and they were able to successfully prove that they were not in the United were not from the United States, and that they were being smuggled in, and therefore they should have their freedom. And John Quincy Adams successfully won them their freedom in the American court system. So they're rare because there's so much fear that it's just not going to succeed, and the repercussions, the punishments that could come back, or slaves might rat them out as a way to get a better condition. So yeah, they just were not common at all. But the other forms of resistance, yes. Okay, that's where we're going to stop. Thank you very much for listening.